The last thing I expected was for my own son-in-law to stand over me at my kitchen table and demand that I sign over the house, the land, and the legacy my late wife and I had built. My blood ran cold as he pushed a stack of papers toward me, his eyes hard with entitlement. He didn't realize that I had already uncovered his scheme, consulted my attorney, and prepared a countermeasure that would leave him stunned in a courtroom months later. He had no clue about the sealed letter from my wife that would be read at a crucial moment, or the secret clause in my trust that would put my grandson's future ahead of his greed. There were decisions I made quietly in the days leading up to his ultimatum, decisions involving a safe deposit box, a call to the county recorder's office, and a conversation with my granddaughter that would change the trajectory of our family. If you're curious about how this unfolded, keep listening because the twists are just beginning. Before I get into the full story, please drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from. It's a small way for all of us to connect, and your own experiences might resonate with mine and help others feel less alone. My name is Jack, and I'm a 68-year-old retired machinist living on the outskirts of Phoenix, Arizona, where the desert is both harsh and beautiful, and where the summer sun scorches the ground but paints the sunsets red and gold. Before I tell you how my daughter's husband demanded that I sign everything over, I need to take you back to the life I built over 4 decades. Because context matters, and because betrayal doesn't sting unless trust is established first. I grew up in Tempe, the son of a carpet installer and a school secretary, and I learned early on that hard work was the ticket to survival in a family that always seemed to be one sick day away from financial ruin. My father, a man with thick forearms and a light touch for precision cutting, kept a row of tools in our garage that looked like artifacts: hand planes from his father, spools of carpet binding, and a wooden mallet with a cracked handle that he refused to replace. On Saturdays, he would take me to Ace Hardware for supplies, and we'd stop by a Circle K convenience store on the way to get cold bottles of Dr. Pepper and a pack of peanuts that we would split in the truck while listening to Merle Haggard on the AM radio. Those drives bonded us, and they taught me something else. There is dignity in providing for your family through calloused hands, and there is peace in the steady rhythm of a job done right. I met my wife Linda in 1981 at a community college welding class. She was the only woman there, slender and fierce, the daughter of a cattle rancher from Prescott, determined to learn a trade so she could help fix fence gates on her father's land. We got married at the county courthouse 2 years later and celebrated afterward with tacos from Taco Bell and a homemade cake from her mother. We couldn't afford anything fancy, but we were richer than we realized because we had each other and a shared vision for our future. We saved diligently, forgoing vacations and eating out so we could put down a 20% deposit on a patch of desert land between Phoenix and Surprise. By 1990, we broke ground on a modest house that we designed ourselves, 3 bedrooms, a workshop, and a wide porch looking toward the White Tank Mountains. To build that house, I spent evenings and weekends after my 8-hour shifts at a small aerospace machine shop. Linda did the wiring and plumbing with the help of library books and the guidance of a retired electrician we met at Home Depot who took a liking to our tenacity and our willingness to learn. Those days were exhausting and exhilarating. We poured concrete by hand, lifted roof trusses in the dim light before dawn to beat the heat, and collapsed at night with our muscles aching and our hearts full. When our daughter Amy arrived in 1988, she became the center of our world. Linda and I took turns rocking her at midnight, and I remember thinking that I wanted to build a life sturdy enough for her to stand on, something that would last beyond me. I also promised myself that I would always be there for her, not in an overbearing way, but as the steady, reliable presence my own father had been. I had no idea that this pledge would be tested in a way that would shake me to my core. As Amy grew, we taught her the value of work. She helped her mother collect eggs from the small coop we built and pulled weeds in the vegetable garden that Linda insisted we plant despite the dry climate, using drip irrigation and mulch from Lowe's to make it flourish. She also developed a keen sense of entitlement that we failed to curb, perhaps because we wanted to give her what we never had. We bought her a used Honda Civic when she turned 16 and co-signed on her student loans so she could attend Arizona State University and major in business administration. Linda used to remind me that love isn't about providing everything, it's about teaching responsibility, but I couldn't resist those pleading eyes and the hope that a little extra help would set Amy on the path to success. After college, Amy married a man named Greg who worked at a car dealership and claimed he was going to start his own used car lot. He wore a flashy watch, drove a leased BMW, and had a way of talking that made you feel like you were in on a secret only he knew. Greg asked us to invest in his business idea, and against my better judgment, I loaned him $40,000 from a certificate of deposit I had just renewed at Wells Fargo. The banker warned me that early withdrawal could mean losing interest, but allowed me to take the money with the understanding that I might have a hold placed on large deposits when it went back in. I drew up a promissory note using a template from a legal forms website, and Greg signed it at our kitchen table while Linda served coffee and cinnamon rolls. He smiled, promised to repay us within a year, and told us we'd be proud partners in a thriving enterprise. Linda looked uneasy, but she trusted me. The check we wrote to Greg felt like a leap of faith, and I insisted that we'd be fine because our emergency fund in a high-yield savings account at Alley Bank was still untouched. The economy took a downturn the following year, and Greg's business never materialized. Instead, he used the money to buy a brand-new Chevrolet Silverado with chrome rims and a top-of-the-line sound system. When I confronted him, he shrugged and said the truck was necessary to impress clients who never seemed to show up. I reminded him of the promissory note, but he always had an excuse, and because Amy defended him, our relationship with them became strained. Dinners at our house turned into arguments about personal responsibility versus supporting family, and the tension weighed heavily on Linda's heart. Then, in 2019, Linda was diagnosed with breast cancer. She fought valiantly through surgeries, chemotherapy, and radiation. But by the spring of 2021, the disease had spread, and on a breezy April morning she slipped away while I was holding her hand and reading a passage from a devotional she loved. Losing Linda was like losing the compass that had guided me through adult life. Our home felt empty, and I found myself wandering through the workshop, touching tools we had used together, each one a portal to a memory. People told me to downsize, to sell the house and move closer to town, but I couldn't imagine leaving the place where every corner echoed with Linda's laughter, and where we had planted creosote and mesquite trees that now provided shade in the blazing heat. I also couldn't imagine that Greg would soon attempt to take it away from me. His greed knew no bounds, and he saw my grief as an opening. Greg began to show up unannounced, bringing Amy and my 2 young grandsons, and he would make comments like, "This property would make a great development lot," or, "You're all alone out here. Wouldn't it be easier to move into town?" He also started asking probing questions about my will and the deed to the house. At first, I thought he was concerned about estate planning because he knew how much Linda and I had in retirement accounts and life insurance, but then he asked me to sign papers transferring the property into a joint family trust. His pitch sounded plausible. He claimed it would simplify probate and protect the home from taxes. He even provided documents that he insisted his friend, an attorney at the county courthouse, had prepared. When I read the documents, I noticed that the trust granted Greg and Amy power of attorney over my financial affairs immediately, not upon incapacity, and that the house would be sold upon my death, with proceeds split between them and their children. I also noticed that the language about my right to live in the house was conspicuously absent. I told Greg I needed to review the documents with my own attorney, and he became defensive. He said I didn't trust him and that lawyers would just take my money, which set off alarm bells in my head because only someone with something to hide would discourage legal counsel. I decided to consult with Ms. Harris, an estate planning attorney recommended by my neighbor and friend Tom, who had recently updated his will after his brother tried to contest their mother's estate. Ms. Harris reviewed the documents and confirmed my suspicions. She explained that transferring property into a trust can be a smart move when done correctly. but the language in Greg's documents essentially stripped me of ownership and allowed Greg to sell the property or use it as collateral without my consent. She also reminded me of Arizona's community property laws and explained that because the house had been purchased during my marriage and my wife had predeceased me, I had full control over it, and no one could force me to relinquish that right. After our meeting, I drove to Fry's grocery store to pick up some groceries and ran into my old boss, Mr. Sanchez, who had retired a few years ago. We chatted in the produce aisle while I inspected avocados and asked him if he'd ever dealt with family members pressuring him to sign over assets. He told me about his cousin in Texas who lost his ranch because he trusted his son-in-law and signed a deed without reading it. The story made me more determined to protect what Linda and I had built. Back at home, I wrote a letter to Amy detailing my concerns and why I couldn't sign over the property. I emphasized that I loved her and the boys, but that I needed to ensure my own security and that of future generations. I handed the letter to her the next day when she came by with Greg. She barely looked at it before tossing it aside and accusing me of being paranoid and selfish. Greg called me stubborn and said he was offering me a way to simplify things before something happened to me. When I stood firm, he slammed his fist on the dining table we had built from reclaimed pine and said, "If you don't sign it all over, you'll be sorry when it's too late." His words hung in the air like a storm cloud, and for a moment I was transported back to a time when, as a boy, I had been bullied on the playground and told to hand over my lunch money. Only now the bully sat in my house and wore a wedding band tied to my daughter. I refused again, and he stormed out, dragging Amy and the boys with him. My daughter didn't meet my eyes as she left, and the sound of the front door slamming reverberated through the house, leaving me with a mix of sadness, anger, and determination. In the days that followed, Greg escalated his campaign. He sent me text messages quoting bogus statistics about how long it takes to settle probate in Arizona and how my property could end up in legal limbo for years if I didn't act now. He also called me from different numbers, leaving voicemails where he threatened to move the family away and cut off my access to my grandsons. He even had his brother, who works as a paralegal at a title company in Mesa, call me to reassure me that the trust was legitimate. I saved every message, not because I planned to record him. Arizona has a one-party consent law that allows recording conversations as long as one party consents. But Ms. Harris advised me to avoid any potential issues, so I preserved his threats in written form, printing them out and storing them in a folder labeled Evidence next to receipts for property taxes and maintenance. I also visited the county recorder's office to ensure the deed remained solely in my name. The clerk pulled it up and confirmed that there had been no changes. I requested copies of all recorded documents related to the property, just to be safe, and placed them in a fireproof safe Linda and I had bought at Costco years earlier. During this time, I also educated myself on other legal protections. I learned that in Arizona, as in many states, landlords cannot simply change locks to evict someone without going through proper court proceedings. Self-help evictions are illegal and can result in liability for damages, which meant that if Greg tried to force me out, he would be breaking the law. I also found a pamphlet at the library that explained deposit holds. It reminded me that banks must make the first $225 of a check deposit available the next business day, and that amounts over. That can be held for several days. This knowledge had saved me before when I sold a vintage tool set to a collector and deposited his cashier's check at Chase, waiting for the hold to clear before releasing the tools. Armed with information and support, I returned home and began to prepare. I updated my will to clarify that my property would be held in a testamentary trust for my grandchildren with a life estate for me, meaning I could live there until I died, but the property would eventually pass to my grandsons when they reached the age of 30. I also named Ms. Harris as the trustee to ensure impartial administration. I wrote letters to Amy and Greg explaining these changes and mailed them via certified mail, keeping the receipts and tracking numbers. I wanted proof that they had been informed. For weeks I heard nothing. The silence was both a relief and a weight, leaving me with time to reflect on the fact that the people I loved most were now adversaries. During that quiet, I immersed myself in my hobbies. I spent mornings tinkering in my workshop, restoring an old radial arm saw I had bought at a swap meet, and polishing the wrenches Linda gave me our first Christmas. I brewed strong coffee in my Mr. Coffee machine and listened to classic rock on a dusty radio, letting the familiar tunes settle my nerves. I also joined a seniors group at the local community center where we played cribbage and attended classes on estate planning and fraud prevention. The facilitator, a retired banker, emphasized the importance of never signing documents you don't understand and of consulting professionals. At one meeting, a woman named Joyce told a story about her nephew forging her signature on a power of attorney form. The resulting legal battle took years because court dockets were backlogged, especially following the pandemic, which forced the probate court to adjust schedules and prioritize cases, leaving routine matters waiting for months. Joyce's story made me grateful for my foresight and resolved me to handle my affairs before I ended up like her, stuck in legal limbo while unscrupulous relatives fought over my assets. About 2 months after Greg's outburst, I received a notice in the mail. It was a petition filed by Greg and Amy in probate court seeking guardianship over me, claiming that I was no longer competent to manage my affairs due to age-related decline and grief, and requesting that the court grant them control of my finances and property. I felt my pulse quicken as I read the document. My hands trembled, not from fear of losing my assets, but from the betrayal by my own child. I took a deep breath, swallowed my anger, and called Ms. Harris. She explained that guardianship petitions are serious and that I would need to undergo a court-ordered capacity evaluation. She also assured me that because I had previously updated my estate plan, the court would consider that evidence of my intentional planning and competence. She filed a response on my behalf, requesting that the court dismiss the petition on grounds that it was filed in bad faith. She also advised me to document everything, from my daily activities to my finances, to prove I was capable. My granddaughter Emily, who had just turned 19 and was studying nursing at the University of Arizona, called me that evening. She apologized for her mother's behavior and asked if she could help in any way. I told her about the guardianship petition and my plan to fight it, and she promised to testify on my behalf if needed. Her support bolstered my resolve. I decided to take additional steps to safeguard my home, so I installed a Ring video doorbell and a Simply Safe security system, not to catch anyone illegally, but to monitor any unexpected visitors. I also notified the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office that I was concerned about potential trespassers. In the weeks leading up to the court hearing, I kept busy with my routine. I drove my old Ford F-150 to the Desert Botanical Garden in Phoenix and walked the trails, breathing in the scent of creosote after a rare monsoon rain and taking photographs of blooming saguaro cacti. I cooked meals from scratch, using my crock pot to simmer beans seasoned with smoked paprika and garlic while I sanded the finish on a pine bookshelf. I also thought a lot about my father, who had passed away 10 years earlier. He had never had to deal with a betrayal of this magnitude, but he had always told me, "Document everything, stand your ground, and never be rushed into signing something you don't understand." Those words became my mantra, and when the day of the hearing arrived, I dressed in my best Wrangler jeans and a pressed plaid shirt, grabbed my folder of evidence, and drove to the courthouse in downtown Phoenix. The courthouse was bustling with activity. Attorneys in suits whispered to clients in hallways. People lined up outside the clerk's office to file paperwork, and the smell of stale coffee filled the air from the small kiosk near the entrance. I checked in with the bailiff and took a seat in the pew-like benches of the courtroom. As we waited for the judge, I noticed Greg seated at the front with his attorney. He turned around briefly, and our eyes met. There was a hardness in his gaze that made me wonder who he had become and whether he truly believed what he was doing was right. The judge, a middle-aged woman with clear eyes and a firm voice, took the bench and called our case. Ms. Harris presented evidence of my competence, medical records showing I had no cognitive impairment, letters from friends and neighbors attesting to my daily activities, and a summary of the estate plan I had executed. Greg's attorney argued that I had been manipulated by others, but when pressed, he could not provide specific examples. The judge asked Greg whether he had financial motives, and he insisted his only concern was my well-being, though his eyes flickered when she asked about the proposed distribution of my assets in the trust he had drafted. After 2 hours of testimony, the judge took a brief recess and returned with a ruling. She dismissed the petition, citing lack of evidence, and admonished Greg and Amy for wasting the court's time. She noted that the court's docket was already overloaded with legitimate cases and that using guardianship proceedings as a weapon was reprehensible. Walking out of that courtroom was like stepping into a new chapter. I felt lighter, not because the conflict was over. It wasn't. But because the law had recognized my autonomy, and because I had proven to myself that I could stand up for what Linda and I built. Greg and Amy left quickly, avoiding eye contact. I wondered what conversation they were having, whether they would double down or back off. But I pushed the thought aside and instead treated myself to lunch at a nearby Whataburger, ordering a patty melt and fries and savoring the taste of vindication. After the hearing, I decided I needed to ensure this saga didn't repeat itself. I transferred ownership of my house into a revocable living trust where I was the trustee and sole beneficiary during my lifetime. The successor trustee was Ms. Harris, and the trust stipulated that after my death, the house would go to my grandsons under conditions promoting education and financial responsibility. I also made a charitable bequest in the trust to donate $20,000 to Habitat for Humanity, to honor Linda's love of building, and to support others looking to create secure homes. These steps provided me peace of mind, but they also forced me to face the emotional fallout with Amy. I missed my daughter, and I missed the warmth we once shared, even if it had been eroded by years of enabling and misunderstanding. I reached out to her, inviting her to meet at a park halfway between our homes. She agreed, and we sat on a bench under a mesquite tree while the late afternoon sun cast long shadows on the playground, and children laughed in the distance. I told her I loved her, and that my decisions were not intended to punish her, but to protect myself and preserve what I had built. I asked her to tell me what had driven her to support Greg's scheme. Amy looked down at her hands and confessed that they were drowning in debt. Credit cards, medical bills from an emergency appendectomy, and a second mortgage on their own home. Greg had pressured her to go along with his plan because he saw my land as a lifeline out of his own financial mismanagement. Her admission broke my heart because it revealed both the pressure she was under and the fact that she had allowed herself to be manipulated by her husband's greed. I reminded her that I would have helped them if they had come to me honestly, but that trust had been broken. We sat in silence for a long time. The smell of hot asphalt mingled with the scent of freshly cut grass from the adjacent soccer field. Eventually, Amy wiped her eyes and said she understood why I did what I did. She apologized, and while the wound would not heal overnight, forgiveness begins with truth. In the months that followed, I continued building a life anchored in resilience and community. I volunteered at the St. Mary's Food Bank in downtown Phoenix, packing boxes of canned goods and produce for families in need. I mentored a younger neighbor, Tony, teaching him how to change his own oil and replace brake pads on his Toyota Camry. We spent Saturday mornings under the shade of my carport with wrenches, oil pans, and conversations about life. I took up woodworking in a more serious way, crafting cutting boards and picture frames for the local craft fair. I bought lumber from Lowe's and shaped it using the miter saw Linda and I had purchased years ago, finishing the pieces with beeswax and mineral oil while listening to the soft hum of a small portable fan. I also started a weekly breakfast tradition at IHOP with a group of friends from the community center. We rotated topics we'd discuss over our pancakes and coffee: Medicare open enrollment, scams targeting seniors, and the importance of having a durable power of attorney and advance directive. At one of those breakfasts, an older gentleman named Harold shared how a relative had stolen his Social Security checks by forging his signature. The case took nearly 2 years to resolve because the county court was backed up. The lesson was clear. Vigilance, documentation, and proactive planning are essential. Listening to these stories solidified my sense that what happened with Greg was not an isolated incident. Families fracture over money more often than we realize, and many seniors become victims because they don't know their rights or fear rocking the boat. I decided to turn my ordeal into a teaching moment. I collaborated with the community center to host a workshop called Protecting Your Assets and Your Dignity, where I shared my story and invited Ms. Harris to speak about wills, trusts, and elder fraud. We provided printed handouts outlining key protections such as the fact that banks are required to provide written notice of deposit holds and that guardianship petitions should be carefully scrutinized. We also offered attendees a checklist: review account statements regularly, freeze credit when not applying for loans, and register for property fraud alerts with the county recorder's office. The program was well attended, and I felt a sense of purpose beyond my own house. Through these efforts, I reconnected with my grandson, David, who came to one of the sessions out of curiosity. After the workshop, we ate lunch at Chipotle, and he asked me about my life with Linda, our early struggles, and the satisfaction of building something tangible. Our conversation lasted 2 hours, and by the end he told me he wanted to take a semester off from his pre-law studies to work with Habitat for Humanity and learn carpentry. His interest made me realize that legacy isn't just about passing on property. It's about passing on knowledge and values. I also reconnected with Emily, who had been my ally during the guardianship battle. She invited me to volunteer at a free clinic where she shadowed nurses. I helped in the lobby, handing out clipboards and answering questions from patients. The clinic served many uninsured individuals, and the gratitude in their eyes reminded me that community extends beyond family. During one shift, a woman approached me with tears in her eyes, explaining that her landlord had changed the locks on her apartment after she fell behind on rent. She didn't know her rights, and I told her that landlords cannot conduct self-help evictions. They must follow legal procedures, give proper notice, and obtain a court order. I wrote down the number for the local legal aid society and encouraged her to seek help. When I left the clinic that afternoon, the weight of my own ordeal felt lighter. I realized that by sharing my story, I was not only healing myself, but helping others avoid similar pain. One evening, while watching the news, I saw a story about how county probate courts were implementing new online case management systems to reduce backlogs. The reporter interviewed a judge who explained that the pandemic had caused an influx of filings and that cases were still taking months to schedule. I nodded knowingly, remembering Joyce's cautionary tale and my own brush with the system. I decided to write to the Arizona Republic's opinion page, highlighting the need for more resources for probate courts and elder law education. My letter ran in print the following Sunday, and I received a phone call from a local journalist who wanted to interview me for a feature on elder financial abuse. I agreed, and the article, published a few weeks later, detailed my experience and included comments from Ms. Harris about the importance of legal literacy. The story resonated with readers, and I received emails from strangers thanking me for speaking out. Among the messages was one from a man named Phil in Tucson who told me that he had been pressured by his son to sign over his home. After reading the article, he sought legal advice and discovered that the deed his son drafted was fraudulent. He fought back and kept his house. Hearing that my story helped someone else affirm my belief that even painful experiences can be transformed into something useful when shared with honesty. Throughout all of this, I found moments of quiet joy. I would wake early and step onto the porch with a mug of Folgers coffee, inhale the crisp morning air that still held traces of the night's coolness, and listen to quail calling in the desert. I would watch the first rays of sunlight illuminate the mountains and reflect on how fortunate I was to still be standing on this land. Sometimes I would pick up my old journal, an inexpensive spiral notebook I bought at Target, and scribble down thoughts, memories, and lists of things I wanted to do. Visit the Grand Canyon again, take a road trip along Route 66, teach David how to replace a faucet, plant more desert marigolds by the walkway. At night, I would sit in the darkened living room, the only light coming from the LED numbers on the microwave, and run my fingers along the wood grain of the coffee table Linda and I built. I would whisper her name and feel her presence in the house, not as a ghost but as an enduring love that bound me to this place. I also continued my weekly calls with Emily. She told me about her classes, the challenges of clinical rotations, and her dream of becoming a nurse practitioner. She asked me for advice on balancing school, work, and personal life, and I shared stories about the long nights I spent working overtime to make ends meet. One day, after finishing a shift at the clinic, she called and said, "Grandpa, I know you're wary of technology, but have you ever thought about writing down everything you've learned in a document that could be shared online?" I chuckled, but the idea intrigued me. I had always kept journals, but the thought of turning my experiences into a guide for others seemed like a natural extension of the workshops I'd been giving. Over the next few months, I wrote an informal handbook titled Guarding Your Legacy, a practical guide for seniors. I included chapters on estate planning, recognizing scam calls, understanding deposit hold policies, and the importance of having a durable power of attorney. I also included personal anecdotes about my father's advice, Linda's wisdom, and the lessons I learned from the ordeal with Greg. I printed the handbook at Office Depot in spiral-bound format and distributed it at the community center. Emily helped me upload it as a PDF to the center's website. It felt good to know that my story would continue to help others long after I was gone. As summer turned to fall and the desert nights grew cooler, I celebrated with a small gathering of friends and neighbors under the string lights I'd hung across the back patio. We grilled burgers, served baked beans in a Pyrex dish, and toasted with cold root beer. I looked around at the faces of people who had supported me and realized that I was not alone. At one point, David pulled me aside and said, "Grandpa, I want to thank you for not giving up on us, even when Mom and Greg were making terrible choices. Your strength has taught me that standing firm is not the same as being cruel." His words brought tears to my eyes. This journey had been painful, but it had also forged new connections and strengthened existing bonds. I hugged him, and for a moment I felt the weight of the past years lift. In the following months, Amy and I continued working on our relationship. She filed for divorce from Greg after discovering more lies and learning that he had racked up thousands of dollars in gambling debt. It was a difficult decision, but she told me she wanted to break free from his toxicity and rebuild her life. She moved into a small apartment in Glendale with the boys and started working at Safeway to make ends meet. She came to me not for money but for guidance on budgeting and debt management. We sat at my kitchen table, spread out her bills, and created a plan. I showed her how to negotiate lower interest rates and how to prioritize high-interest debts. We also visited a local credit union to open a savings account for each of my grandsons. I deposited $100 into each account and told them I would match whatever they saved from their allowances and part-time jobs. Their eyes lit up at the idea of their money doubling, and I felt a surge of hope that the cycle of financial mismanagement might end with Greg. At the same time, I remained vigilant. I updated the security settings on my online banking accounts and set up alerts for any unusual activity. I met with a representative from Fidelity, where my IRA was held, to review beneficiary designations and ensure that my accounts would pass directly to the trust upon my death. I also purchased a prepaid funeral plan from a local funeral home to spare my family from making difficult decisions at an emotional time. The plan included a simple pine casket, a graveside service at the Veterans Cemetery, and a donation to the Wounded Warrior Project in lieu of flowers. Linda and I had discussed our final arrangements many times. She had chosen cremation and requested that her ashes be scattered in the garden under the mesquite tree she loved. I had honored her wishes, and I wanted to make mine clear so there would be no confusion or conflict. As the year ended, I compiled a binder labeled "In Case of My Death," containing copies of my will, trust, insurance policies, account statements, passwords written in code, and instructions for my funeral. I placed the binder in the fireproof safe and told Emily where to find it, trusting her with this responsibility. Reflecting on everything that happened, from Greg's demand that I sign over my property to the court battle, the subsequent workshops, and the rebuilding of my family, I realized that my journey had been one of reclaiming dignity and establishing boundaries. I also realized that the legacy I would leave behind wasn't just a house or money. It was the example of resilience, the lessons on financial literacy, and the commitment to justice that would live on in my grandchildren and in the community I served. The narrative arc of my life has taught me that betrayal can be an invitation to grow stronger, that legal tools exist to protect the vulnerable, and that standing firm with kindness can transform relationships. So, if you're listening to this story and you've ever been pressured by family to relinquish control, I hope you take comfort in knowing that you are not alone. There are laws to support you. There are professionals who can help, and there is a community of people like me who have walked through the fire and come out tempered rather than burned. Before I end this story, let me ask, where are you listening from? And have you or someone you know faced a situation where family members tried to manipulate or control assets? Please share your experiences in the comments and remember that your voice matters. By speaking up, you may help someone else find the courage to protect their legacy. And if you appreciated this story, consider subscribing and turning on notifications because there are many more true stories about quiet strength and poetic justice coming your way. Thank you for listening to the end. May you find peace, clarity, and the strength to stand up for yourself when it matters most. I realized there was still so much more to share about the road that led me to this chapter and the lessons I continue to learn each day. After Linda passed and before Greg's ultimatum, I spent a year traveling around Arizona and neighboring states in my truck, revisiting places we had gone together and discovering new spots that filled me with nostalgia and wonder. I drove north to Flagstaff, stopping at a Circle K for gas and a cup of decaf coffee before winding through the tall ponderosa pines and sitting on a bench outside Lowell Observatory where we had once looked at Mars through a telescope and marveled at its red glow. From there I continued to the small town of Winslow, made famous by the Eagles song, and I stood on the corner, memorialized by the lyrics, and bought a slice of pie at a diner that still played vinyl records on a jukebox. Driving west along Interstate 40, I stopped in Williams, the gateway to the Grand Canyon, and walked into a gift shop filled with Route 66 memorabilia. I purchased a mug that read, "The Mother Road," and thought about the journeys that had carried me from youth to middle age and into this late chapter of life. On another trip, I headed east to New Mexico, crossing the state line at Lupton and taking the old highway through Gallup, where I spent the night at a Motel 6 and ate dinner at a local diner filled with truckers and families. The red neon sign flickered as I sipped a milkshake and listened to the hum of conversation. The next morning I drove to Albuquerque and met an old Army buddy named Mike at a Waffle House off the 25. We spent hours over hash browns and coffee, swapping stories about our years as young men living in barracks and working on armored vehicles, and he shared his own struggles with his children who had tried to push him into a nursing home prematurely. Hearing his story reminded me that generational conflict is not unique to my family. Many of us wrestle with the tension between staying independent and accepting help, and the key is distinguishing genuine support from manipulation. After New Mexico, I traveled south to Bisbee, an old mining town near the Mexican border. The narrow streets and colorful Victorian houses perched on hillsides transported me back in time. I stayed at a bed and breakfast run by a retired teacher who baked blueberry muffins from scratch and kept a record of guest stories in a worn ledger. In the evening, I sat on the balcony overlooking Brewery Gulch and watched the sun set over the Mule Mountains while sipping iced tea. I struck up a conversation with a couple from Wisconsin who were hiking across the country, and we talked about how travel fosters resilience and perspective. These trips gave me a sense of freedom and restored my confidence. They also provided opportunities to encounter everyday kindness from strangers, such as the cashier at Safeway in Sedona, who complimented my Route 66 mug and asked about my travels. At each stop, I carried with me Linda's memory. I wore her old denim jacket when the nights grew cold and tucked her picture in the truck's sun visor. Sometimes, as I drove along empty roads, I would speak aloud to her, narrating my observations and feeling as though she were listening. When I returned to Phoenix, I would bring back small souvenirs, sandstone rocks from the desert, postcards of places I'd visited, and place them on a shelf in my workshop next to the antique tools. This shelf became a visual diary of my grief journey and my path toward healing. My travels also deepened my appreciation for the land and the communities that nurture it. In Prescott, I visited the courthouse square and watched a rodeo parade, hearing the clop of horses' hooves and the applause of spectators lined along the street. I thought about the importance of tradition and the way rituals anchor us. In Payson, I stopped at a library book sale and bought several volumes on Arizona history, which I read late at night while drinking chamomile tea from Trader Joe's. I learned about the indigenous tribes who cultivated this land long before settlers arrived and about the miners who carved tunnels into mountains in search of copper and silver. These stories of perseverance resonated with me. I saw my own life reflected in them. The desire to build something lasting, the struggle against forces beyond one's control, and the determination to leave a mark on the world. After my road trips, I settled back into a routine that included daily walks around my neighborhood. I would leave the house before sunrise, the air still cool, and stroll past saguaros silhouetted against a pale sky. Sometimes I would see a roadrunner dart across the road or hear coyotes howling in the distance. On these walks, I often stopped at my neighbor Claire's house. She is a widow in her 70s who breeds succulents and keeps a thriving garden despite the arid climate. We would sip coffee at her kitchen table, and she would show me the new grafts she was experimenting with, explaining how she mixes soil from Home Depot with perlite for optimal drainage. Claire became a confidant. She listened without judgment as I recounted the latest developments with Amy and Greg. She shared her own experiences of raising a son who struggled with addiction and taught me that letting go doesn't mean abandoning love. It means loving someone enough to allow them to face consequences. Another routine that kept me grounded was volunteering with a veterans organization that helps former service members transition back into civilian life. I joined a group that refurbished donated cars for vets, partnering with local mechanics who offered discounts on parts from O'Reilly Auto Parts and Napa Auto Parts. We would meet at a garage south of downtown, roll up our sleeves, and change oil filters, replace brake pads, and fix timing belts. I took pride in handing over keys to a gleaming, roadworthy vehicle, to a young man or woman who needed reliable transportation to get to work or school. During these sessions, we swapped stories about our time in the service, our families, and our fears. One man named Darrell confided that his daughter had forged his signature to take out a payday loan in his name. He discovered it when the bank called about an overdraft, and he had to negotiate with his credit union and file a police report to clear his record. I told Darrell about my own situation, and we both shook our heads at how those closest to us sometimes become the ones who hurt us. We resolved to keep fighting for our dignity and to help others do the same. Some afternoons I volunteered at a local elementary school as a reading buddy. The school, located in a lower-income neighborhood, welcomed community members to sit with students and help them practice reading. My assigned student, an 8-year-old named Carlos, loved stories about cowboys and space explorers. We sat in the library under fluorescent lights and read Dr. Seuss books. Carlos stumbled over words like astronaut and lasso, but his eyes lit up when he understood the story. I learned patience and the joy of being part of someone else's learning journey. Carlos reminded me of my younger self, a boy eager to learn but limited by circumstances. I took this as an opportunity to not only practice reading, but also teach him about resilience by sharing simple analogies from my life, like how sanding a rough plank takes time and effort but results in a smooth, strong board. On weekends, I made a point of attending my grandson's soccer games. I sat in the bleachers under the scorching sun, wearing a wide-brimmed hat and sipping water from a hydro flask. I cheered when they scored goals and offered encouragement when they missed. Watching them play, I marveled at how quickly children grow and how important it is to be present in their lives. I vowed to be the grandfather who shows up, not just the one who sends birthday cards with checks. To that end, I began teaching them practical skills. We worked together in my workshop, building simple birdhouses from scraps of cedar and pine. They learned to measure using a tape measure, mark lines with a carpenter's pencil, and cut wood carefully with a handsaw under my guidance. We also took trips to Home Depot to pick out nails and sandpaper. I let them push the cart, and we talked about the difference between Phillips and flathead screws, about why oak is heavier than poplar, and about always returning tools to their proper place. These sessions served a dual purpose. They taught my grandsons respect for tools and the value of craftsmanship, and they strengthened our bond, one board at a time. I also introduced them to baking. On a rainy Saturday, we made chocolate chip cookies using a recipe Linda had perfected. We measured flour and sugar with Pyrex measuring cups, cracked eggs, and mixed the dough using an old wooden spoon. The smell of cookies baking filled the kitchen, and we laughed when one of the boys spilled vanilla extract on the counter. Teaching them how to bake reminded me that life's lessons come in many forms, some in the garage with sawdust and others in the kitchen with flour, and that these small moments create lasting memories. In between volunteer work and family time, I nurtured my own intellectual curiosity. I enrolled in a night class at the local community college called History of the American Southwest. The professor, a soft-spoken woman with a Ph.D., took us through the intricacies of Spanish colonization, indigenous resistance, and the formation of states like Arizona and New Mexico. Sitting in a classroom with students half my age, I relished the chance to broaden my perspective. During breaks, I stood in the hallway under the glare of fluorescent lights, talking to a young woman majoring in political science who was writing a paper about water rights and the Colorado River Compact. We discussed how the region's scarce water resources drive policy and community relations, and I shared my experiences of installing low-flow fixtures and planting drought-tolerant vegetation. Our conversation made me feel valued and engaged, bridging generational gaps. On some nights, I attended meetings of a local genealogy club, where a group of older adults sat around long tables in a public library conference room, each with a laptop open to Ancestry.com or Family Search. We exchanged tips on tracing lineage and read old census records from microfilm machines. I discovered that my great-grandfather had immigrated from Ireland to Boston in the late 1800s and then traveled by train to Arizona to work on the railroad. This discovery deepened my sense of rootedness and connection to the past. During the genealogy research, I also stumbled across letters my great-grandmother had written, preserved by a distant cousin. In one letter, she wrote about signing a contract with a railroad company and being careful to read every line. Her cautionary tale felt eerily relevant and reminded me that vigilance regarding documents runs in my blood. Every few months I visited the doctor for routine checkups, my primary care physician, Dr. Patel kept me on track with screenings and blood work. During one appointment, he asked about my stress levels, and I told him about the guardianship petition and the strain of family conflict. He recommended I join a support group for caregivers and those dealing with elder financial abuse. The support group met at a nearby senior center on Wednesday evenings. chairs arranged in a circle. Participants, mostly women but some men, shared stories while the smell of coffee and homemade cookies filled the air. Hearing others speak about their experiences of being pressured for money, exploited by relatives, or scammed by strangers was both heartbreaking and empowering. I shared my story, careful not to violate privacy, and found comfort in the nods and sympathetic glances. The facilitator, a social worker, emphasized strategies like placing bank accounts under dual signature, using a credit freeze, and signing up for text alerts when withdrawals exceed a set threshold. One woman described how her cousin stole checks from her checkbook and forged her signature. She discovered it when a Walgreens cashier asked for her ID during a purchase and the address didn't match. The bank reimbursed her eventually, but the ordeal took months. This story reinforced my commitment to monitoring my accounts. I also learned about new scams. Another man shared that he received a call from someone claiming to be from Medicare, asking for his Social Security number. He hung up, called Medicare directly, and reported the scam. We all nodded when the facilitator said to never give personal information to unsolicited callers. These meetings became a lifeline. They provided both practical advice and emotional support, and they reinforced the idea that vulnerability is not weakness. It's a universal human condition that we can address through community. Outside of the support group, I took up gardening more seriously. I built raised beds using cedar boards from Home Depot and filled them with soil mixed with compost from the city's green waste program. I planted tomatoes, basil, and peppers, learning which varieties thrived in the desert heat and which needed afternoon shade. Watching seeds sprout into seedlings and then produce fruit gave me a sense of renewal and agency. I would walk out with a basket in the morning, pluck ripe tomatoes, and slice them for lunch sandwiches. I would share the harvest with neighbors and the food bank, spreading the bounty. I also cultivated herbs, rosemary, thyme, and oregano, near the kitchen door. Their aromatic leaves scented the air whenever I brushed past, and I used them to season roast chicken or stew, dishes that filled the house with warmth and comfort. In the evenings, after dinner, I would sit on the porch with a book and read until the porch light attracted moths. I revisited old favorites like Steinbeck's East of Eden and discovered new voices like Jesmyn Ward. Reading allowed me to step into other lives and to see my own story from a distance. Sometimes I would put down the book and pick up my guitar, a weathered instrument from my younger days. I would strum chords softly, playing songs by Tom Petty and Johnny Cash. The vibrations of the strings against my fingers grounded me and connected me to a time when music was a constant companion. I also found solace in journaling. Each night before bed, I wrote 1 or 2 pages in a notebook, capturing the day's events, my feelings and thoughts about the future. I wrote about the smell of freshly cut wood, the sound of the wind through the mesquite trees, and my gratitude for a neighbor's kindness. Journaling helped me track my progress, notice patterns, and release worries. Occasionally, I would flip back through older entries and see how far I had come since the days of intense grief and betrayal. On the advice of Dr. Patel, I started practicing yoga at the Y, attending a class designed for seniors. The instructor, a woman in her 50s, guided us through gentle stretches and breathing exercises. At first I felt awkward, but soon I discovered that deep breathing calmed my mind and eased my stiff joints. During Savasana, the final relaxation pose, I would lie on my mat in the dim light and imagine myself floating above the desert, free of burdens. I left each class feeling lighter and more flexible, both physically and mentally. Another new hobby I embraced was bird watching. I purchased a modest pair of binoculars from REI and a field guide to Arizona birds. Early in the mornings, I would walk to a nearby park and sit quietly, scanning the trees for movement. I spotted Gila woodpeckers, verdins, and even a rare western tanager. Keeping a list of birds I'd seen became a satisfying pursuit. Each new sighting felt like a small victory and a reminder that beauty exists all around if we take the time to look. As time passed, I also paid attention to my financial health. I scheduled annual reviews with my financial advisor at Charles Schwab. Together, we assessed my retirement accounts, discussed the required minimum distributions, and adjusted my portfolio to reflect my age and risk tolerance. He recommended I consider long-term care insurance to cover potential nursing home costs, and we shopped policies from carriers like Genworth and Prudential. I chose a policy that would not burden my children while still protecting my assets. We also revisited my estate plan, ensuring that beneficiary designations on my life insurance and IRAs aligned with the trust. He emphasized that outdated beneficiary forms can override wills and trusts, causing assets to go to unintended recipients. This reinforced my practice of reviewing paperwork yearly. Another area I addressed was healthcare directives. I appointed a healthcare proxy, Emily, and filled out a living will stating my preferences for end-of-life care. I discussed these documents with my doctor and my family, emphasizing that I wanted comfort care if I became terminally ill. These conversations were difficult but necessary. They ensured that when the time comes, my family will not have to guess my wishes or argue about what I would want. In addition to personal growth, I sought to broaden my impact beyond my immediate community. I began collaborating with a nonprofit that educates seniors about financial scams. We created informational sessions at libraries and retirement communities and produced leaflets explaining common scams like the grandparent scam, where someone pretends to be a grandchild in distress. During one session at the main branch of the Phoenix Public Library, a man named Robert approached me afterward and confessed that he had nearly wired $10,000 to someone claiming to be his granddaughter stuck in Mexico. He stopped only because the bank teller at Bank of America asked a few probing questions and gently suggested he call his granddaughter directly. Robert's story underscored the importance of frontline workers at banks and credit unions who have been trained to spot red flags. I wrote a thank you letter to the branch manager, praising the teller's vigilance and emphasizing the need for continued training. I also wrote to my state representative to advocate for stronger protections against elder financial exploitation. I urged them to support legislation that would require financial institutions to pause suspicious transactions and contact account holders before releasing funds. In response, the representative invited me to speak at a committee hearing. I prepared a statement, printed copies on yellow legal paper, and drove to the state capitol. I sat behind a microphone in a wood-paneled room and shared my story in 5 minutes, focusing on the importance of education and oversight. After my testimony, several legislators thanked me, and one told me his own mother had been scammed by a rogue contractor. It became clear that this issue transcends politics and touches all families. These advocacy efforts gave me a renewed sense of purpose. They made me feel that my experience, while painful, could contribute to systemic change and prevent others from being harmed. The story of Greg and the guardianship battle sometimes resurfaced, especially on days when I received a letter from his attorney about the promissory note. Greg's lawyer wrote occasionally to remind me that the debt still existed and proposed repayment schedules that never materialized. Ms. Harris advised me to keep documentation and treat the debt as a separate civil matter. She filed a claim in small claims court where the judge ordered Greg to start making payments. He made 2 payments of $500 before defaulting again, and we had to garnish his wages through the dealership he still worked at. The process was slow and tedious because wage garnishment guidelines limit the percentage that can be taken. However, each payment was a small acknowledgement of accountability, and I directed the funds to my grandson's savings accounts, telling them that the money originally meant to invest in their father's business was now being returned to them. Greg occasionally tried to contact me, sending texts apologizing or asking for forgiveness. I responded politely but kept boundaries. I did not invite him to my home, and I directed any legal matters to Ms. Harris. It was a painful but necessary line to draw. Meanwhile, Amy began to flourish. She enrolled in accounting courses at the community college, balancing work, school, and motherhood. She excelled in her classes, often texting me to ask about concepts like debits and credits or to share excitement about mastering Excel spreadsheets. We studied together over FaceTime, screen sharing her practice problems, while I used my laptop's touchpad to highlight cells in a sample balance sheet. These sessions not only built her skills but also rebuilt our relationship on a foundation of trust and mutual respect. As part of her coursework, she interned at a local tax preparation company during tax season. She helped clients gather forms like 1099s and W-2s, and she learned how to use tax software. She told me that the firm had many elderly clients who were confused about required minimum distributions and the taxation of Social Security benefits. Amy realized that education is power, and she talked about eventually providing low-cost financial planning services to seniors so others wouldn't be as vulnerable as she once was. Hearing this warmed my heart because it meant our painful history was transforming into a positive future path for her. During her classes, she also learned about the Expedited Funds Availability Act and told me that banks must make the first $225 of a check deposit available by the next business day, something she had not known before. She appreciated the knowledge and shared it with her classmates, reinforcing the very lessons I had internalized long ago. For my part, I continued to look after my physical health. I scheduled a colonoscopy and a prostate exam, not the most pleasant tasks, but essential for early detection. I encouraged my friends at IHOP to do the same, reminding them that we can't take care of others if we neglect ourselves. I also joined Silver Sneakers, a fitness program for seniors offered through my health insurance. I attended low-impact aerobics classes at the YMCA twice a week and met new acquaintances like Doris, a retired nurse from Kansas, who shared home remedy tips and stories about working night shifts. On Fridays, I treated myself to a drive to the outskirts of town where the desert meets farmland. I would pack a cooler with sandwiches and iced tea and park under the shade of a cottonwood tree. I listened to the sound of irrigation ditches and the rustle of wind through the leaves while writing in my notebook. These solo excursions allowed me to step away from obligations and to reflect on how far I had come. They reminded me that tranquility can be found in simple routines and natural settings. As part of maintaining my mental health, I saw a therapist once a month. Her office was located in a small building off Central Avenue, with a waiting room decorated in soothing earth tones and a shelf of magazines. We talked about boundaries, grief, forgiveness, and the fear of becoming a burden to my family. She helped me recognize that my anger toward Greg stemmed partly from fear of losing my autonomy, fear of being discarded, and fear of seeing my life's work taken away. She also taught me breathing exercises and cognitive reframing techniques that helped me handle stress. One technique involved writing down worst-case scenarios and then challenging them with evidence. For example, when I feared Greg would trick me into signing papers, I reminded myself of the steps I'd taken to secure my documents and the network of support I had. This exercise reduced my anxiety and reinforced my sense of agency. Through therapy, I also explored how my upbringing influenced my reactions. I realized that as the son of working-class parents who lived paycheck to paycheck, I had internalized a fierce need to control my finances and my environment. This awareness helped me communicate better with Amy, explaining why certain actions triggered me so profoundly. At church on Sundays, I found comfort in rituals and community. I attended a small, non-denominational congregation where the pastor, a man in his 50s, spoke about forgiveness and reconciliation without glossing over pain. After services, we would gather in the fellowship hall for coffee and donuts, and I would chat with fellow parishioners about gardening, grandchildren, and local news. One Sunday, the pastor preached about the parable of the prodigal son. Hearing it, I felt a tug in my heart. I thought about Greg and the possibility that he might one day seek genuine repentance. I also thought about my role as a father and grandfather and the delicate balance between compassion and self-protection. These reflections didn't change my boundaries, but they softened my anger, allowing me to wish Greg well from a distance and to focus on my own growth. Throughout the year, I made small improvements to my home. I installed solar lights along the driveway, replaced the aging water heater with an energy-efficient model from Lowe's, and repainted the living room walls in a warm beige that brought out the natural wood of the furniture Linda and I had built. I also repaired the roof after a monsoon storm knocked loose some shingles. I climbed a ladder with my neighbor Tony spotting me, secured the new shingles with a nail gun, and felt a sense of accomplishment as I hammered the last nail. Maintaining the house was not just about preserving property value, but about honoring the life Linda and I created there. During these maintenance tasks, I would often think back to the early days when we built the house. I would recall how Linda and I had borrowed a concrete mixer from a friend to pour the foundation, and how we had measured and cut cedar planks under the heat lamp of a rented U-Haul trailer. Those memories reminded me that the house was more than wood and concrete. It was a repository of love and sweat. Every nail hammered, every plank sanded, and every coat of paint applied contained intention and care. As time went on, I also began to explore digital tools for organization. I purchased a laptop and an external hard drive, and with Emily's help, I scanned old photographs and documents, creating digital backups of everything from my parents' marriage certificate to Linda's recipes. We saved them in organized folders labeled by year and subject. Learning how to use cloud storage and password managers felt daunting at first, but Emily patiently guided me through. She showed me how to generate strong passwords and store them securely using a tool called LastPass. She also taught me to recognize phishing emails and to verify URLs before clicking links. These lessons not only enhanced my security, but also increased my confidence in navigating the modern world. I no longer felt left behind by technology, but instead saw it as another tool I could master. To stay connected with friends and family across the country, I joined a social media platform. I created a profile, posted pictures of my woodworking projects and gardening successes, and commented on my cousin's updates. I discovered that online communities can be supportive and informative when used mindfully. I joined groups focused on woodworking and desert gardening, where members shared tips on finishing techniques and drip irrigation. I even made a new friend, Sam, a retired engineer in Nevada who sent me plans for a tool chest that I later built and gifted to Tony. I also signed up for online newsletters from AARP and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. These newsletters provided timely information about scams, new regulations, and financial planning. When I received an alert about new Medicare cards being issued, I knew to expect mine and to watch for scammers trying to obtain personal information. As I integrated technology into my life, I maintained balance by spending time away from screens. I continued to hike in the Sonoran Desert, taking trails at South Mountain Park early in the morning. The crunch of gravel under my boots and the smell of creosote after a rainstorm grounded me and reminded me that the world is vast and resilient. On one hike, I encountered a young family struggling with a flat tire in the parking lot. I offered to help, retrieved my tire iron and jack from the truck, and taught the father how to change the tire. As I tightened the lug nuts, I thought about the small ways we can support one another that require no documents or signatures, just presence and willingness. I also joined a community choir at the senior center. We practiced once a week, our voices blending in harmony as we sang songs from various eras, from Amazing Grace to Motown classics. Singing released endorphins and brought joy to our rehearsals and performances at retirement homes and veterans hospitals. One of our performances took place at a memory care facility. As we sang familiar hymns, I watched residents' faces light up, some mouthing the words along with us. I recognized that music is a form of memory and connection, bridging gaps when language falters. At home, I began a new project, writing letters to my grandsons that they would open on future milestones, graduations, weddings, the birth of their children. In each letter, I included stories about Linda, lessons on integrity, and advice about love and money. I sealed each envelope, labeled it with a date, and stored them in a cedar box I crafted from leftover lumber. Writing these letters allowed me to speak across time, to ensure that, even if I'm not physically present, my voice will guide them. It was another way of controlling my narrative and ensuring that the values I hold dear persist beyond my lifetime. Around the same time, I decided to tackle a long-delayed project. Sorting through the attic, I climbed the pull-down ladder and stepped into the dusty space where boxes of memories sat untouched for years. I spent days sifting through photo albums, baby clothes, Linda's nursing school notes, and my high school yearbooks. In one box, I found a watch with a cracked crystal and a leather band worn smooth. It had belonged to my grandfather, passed down to me after his death. I had never worn it because I feared damaging it. But now, holding it in my hands, I realized that its value lay not in its monetary worth, but in the memories it carried. I decided to have the watch repaired. I took it to a jeweler at a small shop near downtown who replaced the crystal, cleaned the gears, and restored it to working condition. When I wound it and heard it ticking, I felt a connection to the men who came before me and to the passage of time itself. Wearing my grandfather's watch became a daily ritual. Every morning I wound it and put it on my wrist. Its steady ticking accompanied my movements in the workshop and my conversations at the community center. It served as a reminder that time is both finite and generous if we use it wisely. As I continued to build a meaningful life, I occasionally fielded questions from friends who had heard my story and wanted advice. One man asked if he should put his house in his son's name to avoid probate. I told him that every situation is unique and urged him to consult an estate attorney. I shared my own experience and emphasized the importance of retaining control while planning for the future. Another woman at the support group asked how to handle a situation where her nephew was pressuring her to co-sign a car loan. I advised her to think carefully before taking on debt for someone else, and to consider whether she was willing and able to make the payments if he defaulted. I reminded her that credit is an asset that must be protected. These conversations reinforced my role as a mentor in my community and deepened my own understanding of the complexities of financial and familial relationships. They also motivated me to keep learning and sharing. One day, I received a call from a journalist at a local public radio station who had read the article about my story and wanted to include my experience in a feature on elder financial exploitation. I agreed to share my perspective and provide quotes, but insisted there would be no audio or video recording, only a written piece. We met at a coffee shop downtown. We sat at a corner table with steaming mugs and stacks of notes. She asked me about the guardianship petition, the trust, and the aftermath. I spoke candidly, choosing my words carefully and emphasizing that my goal was not vengeance, but justice and protection. The feature ran the following week in the station's online news section, and my phone rang with calls from acquaintances and strangers who thanked me for sharing. One woman said she felt less alone. Another man admitted he had never considered talking to a lawyer until he read my story. My involvement with media made me more visible, but it also brought a sense of responsibility. I knew I had to continue advocating for others and using my experience to illuminate systemic issues. As the years passed, I continued to mark anniversaries of significant events: Linda's passing, the day of the court hearing, my father's birthday. I lit candles on those days, made Linda's favorite meal of meatloaf and mashed potatoes, or visited the veterans' cemetery to place flowers on my father's grave. Rituals like these helped me honor my past without getting stuck in it. They allowed me to grieve and celebrate simultaneously, blending sorrow with gratitude. At Linda's favorite holiday, Thanksgiving, I would invite a mix of family, friends, and people who had no place to go. We would gather around my oak dining table, now extending with leaves to seat 14 people, and share dishes like green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, and sweet potato pie. Before eating, we went around the table and said what we were thankful for. I always expressed gratitude for resilience, for second chances, and for the ability to help others. My grandsons often mentioned the birdhouses we built or the soccer games I attended, moments that seemed small but were large to them. At Christmas, I continued Linda's tradition of baking cinnamon rolls from scratch and delivering plates of them to neighbors on Christmas Eve. The smell of cinnamon and sugar filled the air as I kneaded dough and watched it rise in the warm oven light. This act made me feel close to her and spread cheer. When the pandemic hit in 2020, our community center closed temporarily and in-person gatherings were limited. I had to adapt my outreach, shifting workshops to Zoom and learning how to unmute and share screens with the help of Emily. Attendance dipped initially, but soon we had attendees from other states, thanks to the virtual format. The pandemic also reminded me of the fragility of life and the importance of adaptability. Supply chain disruptions made it hard to find certain items at the grocery store. So I planted more vegetables and set up a rain barrel from Tractor Supply Company to collect water for the garden. I also participated in a mask sewing project, using Linda's old Singer sewing machine to produce cloth masks for frontline workers. The repetitive motion of guiding fabric under the needle soothed my nerves and gave me a tangible way to contribute. Despite the challenges, the pandemic created opportunities for connection. My family scheduled weekly video calls, and we played virtual games like online Scrabble. I taught my grandsons how to make sourdough starter using flour from Costco and water, then watched them proudly show off their loaves on camera. In the summer of 2021, when vaccines became available, I drove to a CVS pharmacy to get my shot. The pharmacist chatted with me about side effects and scheduling the second dose. I felt a surge of hope walking out with a bandage on my arm, knowing I was contributing to community immunity. That same year, I organized an outdoor potluck at my house to celebrate resilience. We set up tables on the lawn and spaced chairs apart. Guests brought dishes like pasta salad and brownies. We ate, laughed, and shared how we had adapted during isolation. The gathering reinforced the importance of human connection. In the fall, Emily graduated from nursing school. The ceremony was held at an amphitheater, and I sat with my son Andrew and his wife under a clear blue sky. When Emily walked across the stage in her cap and gown, I felt an overwhelming pride and gratitude that she had achieved her dream. After the ceremony, we took pictures on our phones, capturing the milestone. I wrote Emily a letter that night, telling her how her compassion and strength had inspired me, and how her support during my legal battle had made a difference. These letters, whether to Emily, my grandsons, or myself, were acts of love. They anchored my experiences in tangible form and served as a guide for navigating life's complexities. Another venture I undertook was rebuilding the back fence, which had deteriorated over the years. I enlisted Tony and David to help. We removed old boards, dug new post holes, and mixed concrete to secure the posts. We picked up cedar planks from Home Depot and stained them a rich chestnut color. Working side by side, sweating under the Arizona sun, we swapped stories about school, dating, and work. I told them about building the house with Linda, and they told me about job interviews and plans to travel. The fence project took 2 weekends, and when we finished, we admired the sturdy, straight line of boards and high-five each other. Later, as I sat on the patio looking at the new fence, I thought about boundaries, physical and emotional. I realized that building and maintaining boundaries is an ongoing process that requires effort, communication, and vigilance. Around this time, I heard from Greg again. He sent a certified letter apologizing for the pain he caused and asking if we could meet. I wrestled with the decision. Therapy had taught me that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or opening yourself up to further harm. I consulted Ms. Harris, who reminded me that anything Greg said could be used in future proceedings and advised me to think carefully. I eventually agreed to meet him at a coffee shop in a neutral location with Ms. Harris present. At the meeting, Greg looked tired and older. He admitted that greed and pride had driven him to pursue my property. He said that losing his family, job, and reputation had forced him to reevaluate his choices. He asked for forgiveness and offered to sign a new repayment plan for the promissory note. I listened, feeling both compassion and caution. I told him that forgiveness is a journey and that my primary concern was safeguarding myself and the grandchildren. We signed a new agreement with Ms. Harris as the witness and attorney of record. It stipulated a realistic payment schedule and consequences for defaulting. Walking away from that meeting, I felt a mix of relief and unresolved sadness. I had extended an olive branch, but I still held firm boundaries. I realized that sometimes the best we can do is strike a balance between grace and self-protection. As the years rolled on, I continued to fill my days with meaningful activities. I joined a woodworking guild that met monthly at a community shop equipped with state-of-the-art tools. We shared techniques, critiqued each other's work, and collaborated on projects like crafting benches for a local park. I also signed up for a cooking class at a sur la table store in Scottsdale, where a chef taught us how to make fresh pasta and homemade sauce. I learned to knead dough until it was elastic and to let it rest before rolling it out. I returned home with new skills and a belly full of fettuccine. Food became another avenue for connection. I hosted potluck dinners where each guest brought a dish representing their heritage. We enjoyed samosas, lasagna, enchiladas, and gumbo. I learned that sharing meals is a universal expression of love and culture. At one such dinner, a friend named Joanne shared her grandmother's recipe for collard greens cooked with smoked turkey legs. I made notes on an index card and replicated the dish later, savoring the smoky, savory flavors and thinking about the intermingling of histories in each bite. I also attended local fairs and markets. At the Phoenix Flea Market, I browsed stalls selling handmade jewelry, vintage vinyl records, and artisanal soaps. I talked with artisans about their crafts and purchased a hand-thrown ceramic mug that became my favorite vessel for morning coffee. Attending these events not only supported local businesses, but also introduced me to creative people who inspired me to keep learning new skills. I signed up for a pottery class at a community studio, where I learned to throw clay on a wheel and center the spinning mass under my palms. My first attempts produced lopsided bowls, but with practice I created a set of matching mugs that I gifted to Claire. She proudly displayed them on her kitchen shelf, and each time I visited, I was reminded that growth requires patience and willingness to fail. Over the years, I also took short trips to neighboring states, sometimes in the company of friends from the support group. We visited Zion National Park in Utah and hiked the Emerald Pools Trail, standing under waterfalls and feeling the spray on our faces. We marveled at the red cliffs of Zion Canyon and the resilience of cottonwood trees growing in the desert. In Colorado, we drove along the $1 Million Highway between Silverton and Ouray. The narrow, winding road hugged cliffs and offered breathtaking views of snow-capped peaks. We stopped at a roadside stand to buy peach preserves and chatted with the farmer who told us about the challenges of growing fruit at high elevation. These trips reminded me that the world is bigger than my own story and that natural beauty can both humble and elevate us. Back at home, I continued to refine my workshop, organizing tools, labeling drawers, and installing better lighting. I added a pegboard wall for hanging wrenches and pliers, making it easy to see what I needed at a glance. I installed a small mini-split air conditioner to keep the space comfortable during the scorching summer months. I also built a workbench with a vise and drawers for storing screws, bolts, and drill bits. I purchased a set of Milwaukee cordless tools from Home Depot, and the convenience of battery-powered drills and saws increased my efficiency. Each improvement in the workshop translated to increased productivity and more enjoyment. I felt like an artist refining his studio, ensuring that the environment supported creativity and precision. As I aged, I paid attention to mobility and safety. I installed grab bars in the bathroom, added motion sensor lights in the hallway, and placed non-slip mats in the shower. I replaced the old doorknobs with lever handles that were easier on arthritic hands. I also reviewed my insurance policies, ensuring that my homeowner's insurance included liability coverage and that my auto insurance with State Farm offered sufficient protection. I bundled my policies for a discount and confirmed that roadside assistance was included. During one insurance review, my agent suggested umbrella liability coverage. I decided to purchase a $1 million umbrella policy for additional peace of mind, knowing that accidents can happen and that a lawsuit could jeopardize my assets. I shared this information at the community center, encouraging others to consider umbrella policies if they had significant assets to protect. These practical steps made me feel empowered and secure. They complemented the emotional and relational work I was doing and allowed me to live with less anxiety. In my interactions with my grandchildren, I emphasized transparency. I showed them my binder of important documents, explaining what each item was and why it mattered. I told them where to find the key to the fireproof safe and who to call if something happened to me. By involving them in this way, I aimed to demystify financial and legal matters and to prepare them to handle responsibilities when the time came. As time marched on, I watched my grandchildren grow into adolescents and then into young adults. David pursued his passion for carpentry, working for a contractor building custom homes in the West Valley. Emily advanced to become a nurse practitioner at a community health clinic. Andrew moved to Colorado and opened a small chain of coffee shops with his wife, naming one of the blends Grandpa Jack's Morning Brew. Seeing them thrive filled me with pride and reassurance that my legacy was more than a bank account. It was a family of resilient, compassionate people who understood the value of hard work and integrity. I occasionally worried about the future, whether another crisis would test us, but therapy taught me to focus on what I could control and to trust in the systems and relationships I had built. One crisp morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched the sunrise, I realized that my story had come full circle. The man who once gave away $40,000 to a smooth-talking son-in-law had become an advocate for elders, a teacher of financial literacy, and a guardian of his own legacy. I reflected on the title of this story, how my daughter's husband demanded I sign it all over, and how he didn't expect me to be informed, prepared, and supported. I smiled at the thought that knowledge is power and that quiet, persistent strength often prevails over intimidation. Finally, I want to extend one more invitation. If you found value in this story, please share where you're listening from and any insights you have gained. Your experiences matter, and by sharing them, you contribute to a community of wisdom and support. This is not just my story. It's a collective narrative of people who refuse to be sidelined, who seek justice through lawful means, and who believe in leaving the world a little better than they found it. Thank you for walking this long road with me. May you find courage to protect your own legacy and compassion to forgive without forgetting.